right. Welcome, everyone. As everyone's joining, feel free to pop into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from today, and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay. All right. I'm sure people will continue to join, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone today. Thank you for joining our year-long series on emerging Midwest invasives. We are recording and we'll be posting this to our YouTube channel probably should be up before the end of the month. My name is Michelle Belasker. I'm the coordinator for the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and today we're going to be talking about Japanese hop. All right, come on screen. There we go. All right, I wanted to start by thanking our sponsor for today's webinar, the Iowa Weed Commissioners Association. This association works to control noxious weeds, and they're always on the lookout for new vegetation management problems on both public and private land. And they also teach landowners how to manage problematic plants and provide training for all their county weed commissioners and other land management professionals. You can learn more about them, and you can access 35 different brochures that are housed there that have been developed by the Hawkeye CWMA, including one on Japanese hop. So if you just go to their website, which is at the bottom of the screen, you can connect to that information. So before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I just want to give you a little background on the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPPN, and some context for this webinar series. So our organization was formed in 2006, and we work to coordinate invasive species information and activities across agencies and organizations in the Midwest. So we serve this entire region that you see on this map here, 9 states plus the province of Ontario. And our mission is pretty simple. We want to reduce the impacts of invasive plants in the Midwest. Easy to say, not always easy to do. So this particular webinar series was inspired by a survey we conducted at the end of 2022. And we actually just kicked off a repeat of this survey for this year. If you are a invasive species professional or an expert in this field, you can go to our website, mippn.org, and you can take a new version of this survey. But what we do for these surveys is talk to experts across the Midwest about which species they consider to be early detection species. And when we say early detection, that means they're either not in the Midwest yet, but they're in neighboring regions, or they're here, but they're still in isolated pockets. But in either case, we're really concerned about their potential to spread, and we want to make sure they're on people's radar. So we received feedback from every state and province in our region, and these 10 plants that you see listed here really rose to the top of the list and formed the basis for this webinar series. I also created a flyer that talks a little bit about each of these plants, and you can download that at our website. We also have another resource. We recently updated our terrestrial and aquatic Keep a Lookout flyers, which each cover 16 invasive plants, also priority species to have on your radar and report if you see them. So I'll put the link to both of those publications in our chat. And then just to finish up today, if you are enjoying today's presentation and this ongoing series, we encourage you to consider making a donation to MIPPN and support our invasive species education efforts. So again, just keep an eye on the chat. And all these links and donation links and resource links I've mentioned can be found there. So thanks so much for your attention as I go through this. And now I want to introduce our guest speaker for today. So Chris, I'm going to stop sharing and you can go ahead and get your screen going. Okay. So our speaker today is Chris Henze. He's the Roadside Vegetation Manager and County Weed Commissioner for the Johnson County Secondary Road Department in eastern Iowa. Chris has been managing noxious weeds and invasive species in roadsides for nearly 20 years, while being in charge of the Integrated Roadside Vegetation Management Program. While on the job, you might find Chris conducting prescribed burns, planting native grasses and wildflowers, installing erosion controls. You might find him on a tractor or running a chainsaw. He's also the chairperson of the Hawkeye Cooperative Weed Management Area, or CWMA, and he's active in their grant activities and invasive management education efforts as well. And Chris has served on the MIPN Board of Directors since 2010. So we're very happy to have him here today, and I'm going to go ahead and have Chris get started.
Hi guys, glad to be here. Can everybody hear me okay for one? Michelle, can you hear me? Is my screen showing? It's showing up here on mine.
I see you. I don't see your slides yet.
Okay, let's try this again. Let's make sure we're doing it right. Let's see here. Share my screen and try that. There.
That looks like it's
there
working.
we go. There we go. All right. Hi guys. Chris Henze, as Michelle said, I'm the Roadside Vegetation Manager for Johnson County, which is in east central Iowa. To work with the Hawkeye CWMA and work with our secondary roads department and the Iowa Weed Commission Association to try to enforce Iowa noxious weed law across Iowa, and then also to try to manage invasive species just in my particular county. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Japanese hops, which is most of us know is a really problematic vine that's moving rapidly from east to west and north and north, south to north in our area. So why should I worry about Japanese hops? So you can kind of see from this picture that it's in the riparian floodplain. So this picture is real close to the Iowa River. We're in east central Iowa, kind of riparian area in the wetland, and it's on public property. But then the important part here is to look at this tree here in the center part of the screen. So this photo was taken in July of 2021. And then I have a quick video for you. And this is what it looks like taking less than 2 years ago in the off season, the dormant season of that plant. It looks kind of eerie, really. And you can kind of see that tree taken from a different angle. You can see the road back over there that I was taking the picture from. But everything you see there is pretty much Japanese hops, all dead plants, and it's grown up and over everything. And it's pretty much the only species that's allowed to grow, and even suffocating out willow trees and and even the reed canary grass that's trying to crowd in there. So that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, and that's maybe a 3 to 5 acre spot so far. And so far we haven't been able to get in to manage it. It is an area that's regularly flooded. So as Michelle had mentioned, it's one of the top 10 species that we had on the MIPN's emerging invasive species in the Midwest survey. So this particular species was named in all 10 states and provinces that's covered by MIPN. So it's got a fairly wide distribution already. So it was brought here, as you can see, as it was native to Eastern Asia, and like many of our invasive species, was introduced as an ornamental and as a medicinal plant in the 1880s. And it did seen from the other photos, and we'll have some other ones coming up too, that it really prefers riparian and floodplain areas, but it can grow nearly everywhere. And I'll have some pictures of that too, growing in people's backyards and not just along riparian areas. So it's well distributed throughout the U.S. You can see from the top right the area that it's kind of covering. So pretty much from the southeast to the north, clear up into Ontario, and crowding west into Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, that sort of area. You can see from the picture on the lower left what a typical leaf looks like. It's going to have 5 to 7 leaflets. And then the picture on the right I always thought was kind of interesting, that you can see it right there with another really problematic species in the Midwest, and especially the Great Lakes species, and that's Phragmites. And I always thought it was kind of interesting to see, between the two, terrible species, very problematic species, which one's going to win out here? And I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see here, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, which species is going to win. And you can also see that Japanese hop species climbing up the power lines or the anchor wires for those, and then growing up into power lines. So it does become a concern too, not just for recreation or economics, but it does create a problem for utility companies too, as it grows up and over their lines and does grow up and over everything in its path. Kind of similar to, most of us have heard of kudzu, which is the plant that ate the South. And I think Japanese hops is rapidly becoming the plant that's going to become the plant that ate the North. As I'd mentioned before, it was utilized as a tonic in Asian medicines and it's still sold for these purposes. Unfortunately, in the green industry, the ornamental industry, it's a slow learning curve to see some of these species that move in and start causing, large problems in our natural resources, but it's still used in some industries and still readily available from nurseries and greenhouses. And unfortunately, it's not well suited for beer. That's the unfortunate part about a species like that. Its close cousin, common hops, and we'll have some pictures of that coming up, is a species that you would normally utilize for beer, but unfortunately, Japanese hops doesn't seem to be well suited for beer. So how are you going to identify this species in your area? Well, if you're looking around and seeing an annual herbaceous vine, take a closer look. If it's got 5 to 7 leaflets, as compared to common hops, which is 3 leaflets, as you'll notice on the species on the picture on the lower left, that one has many small leaflets, and it does grow up and over everything in riparian areas. In this case, a bridge railing, and in the lower right picture, that's a dead tree that's out in the people's yards. As I mentioned before, it can grow, and not just necessarily in riparian and river areas, but up in turf areas and in your backyard. So that's another species, another area to keep an eye on it for. Fairly easy to identify, but it's going to grow up and over everything, which makes it much more challenging to manage. Obviously, you can see it's climbing and trailing growth habitat. And then another problem for it is it's going to grow 30 to 40 feet in length. So many of the species that it's going to grow up and over, it's going to bury them, as you've seen in that video. Whether it's willow trees or other species in a riparian area, it's going to grow up and over everything, making it much more challenging to get rid of that plant and not to say if you're going to use chemicals, which we'll talk about more in an upcoming slide, much more challenging to get rid of just the hops and not the species underneath it or that it's burying. The really distinct characteristic for Japanese hops is the number of lobes. As compared to the other species, it's going to have 5 to 7. It can occasionally be more. They're real rough to the touch, though. So you can see kind of in the center there, the downward facing prickles. And you can see also from the top right, the downward facing prickles, and then also the little bracts at the junction of the petioles. You can see obviously the prickles, but then the downward facing bracts makes it a little easier to identify between that and common hops. And then also you can see the difference in what the plants look like when they're blooming. That's a bloom of a mature plant, and then that's the male plant. And then the picture on the lower right and the upper right picture, and the lower right of that picture, you can see the female plant. And those all produce seeds that are produced in like cone-shaped achenes, is what they're called. And we'll talk more about that here on some other pictures here coming up. How's this plant spreading in some of its biology? Why is this species such a problem throughout the Midwest and South? Well, it's going to germinate really early in the spring, and then it's going to continue to germinate and spread if the sun and moisture is available, which obviously as the spring progresses, we have more moisture, more sun, and it kind of hides out for a while underneath other vegetation. You might not see a lot of it when you're doing your initial surveys early in the spring. It's going to hang out in that 2-leaf stage. But then once it gets hot, we start getting hotter days of late spring and into summer. At least here in Iowa, we're talking June and July. It grows rapidly once it gets hot. And as you've seen from the videos before, with all the dormant vegetation, it produces thousands and thousands of plants per acre, and it rapidly blankets all the other vegetation. So it becomes a monoculture in a big hurry. Here in Iowa, anyway, I can speak what we have here. It might be a little bit different farther south. Most of that flowering that you're seeing in the lower left occurs in the early to midsummer. Then the seeds maturing through the fall, and then they quit growing. That growth slows. So that's like most of our plants. They are an annual, so they aren't necessarily going dormant. They're slowly dying, but the growth of the plant slows. It's going to go real fast midsummer. Hard frost typically kills this plant, which usually is around October to November around here. And then how is it getting around? Like many of our invasive species, the seeds are dispersed by a variety of mechanisms, and unfortunately, the seeds can float. So as you'd see that lower picture in your lower right, and in the video of that picture, that is in a floodplain of the Iowa River. So every time it floods, those seeds get carried downstream. So you're welcome downstream. You're getting all of the species that the seeds can float, and all that ends up down in the Mississippi and takes off from there. And then you can see in the lower left the cone-shaped achenes that hops are known for. Those are going to produce the seeds. And you can see a picture of the seeds up in the top right. They're fairly small, fairly flat, but as I mentioned, they do want to float, which is definitely a mechanism of dispersal that makes it harder to control. All right, so you've got lots of hops. You've got a huge infestation of it. How are you going to get rid of it? First would be our mechanical varieties. Can you imagine taking that huge clump of vines that person is trying to pull out? It might be okay if you had a small patch of it, but when you have acres and acres of it, it's really not going to be possible when you've got a 30 to 40 to 50-foot vine that are all tangled in and amongst themselves and up and over trees. So it makes it very difficult to pull. It's fairly shallow rooted, but it does make it difficult to pull when it's all tangled up. And then, unfortunately, too, is the locations of the infestations make it challenging to use. So by that I mean if it's a patch of, so we'll say Canada thistle out in the middle of a field, much easier to manage, whether that's spraying or mowing or burning, versus a patch of this that is in riparian areas and stream sides and riversides where you can't get traditional equipment in to use that, whether to mow it or to spray it. So it makes it a little bit more challenging. As I'd mentioned, it's shallow rooted. So if you can get it just like in many of our species or invasive species, if you can get there while there's a small infestation of it, most of it can be pulled. This one is shallow rooted, so it can be pulled before it grows up and over everything, and then goes to other vegetation. And then obviously the prickles that we had shown earlier, those can be pretty irritating to your skin. So you're probably going to need to wear gloves. Doesn't really have any photosynthetic or yeah, I guess that's the right word, but similar to wild parsnip, but the prickles can be irritating to your skin. So then, like many of these species, you're going to need to expect resprouts. Any of the rootstock left in the ground is going to want to regrow. Now, it is an annual vine, so they might not regrow that year, but they expect it to regrow the following year. So as far as cultural, I get asked this pretty regularly in tree plantations, how they could keep small, like a oak plantation or hickory plantation, how they can keep it from growing up and over everything. Well, hops prefers direct sunlight, so the sooner you can get in and close the canopy, the quicker you can get rid of that hops and make it weaker. So if you can grow faster, taller growing trees planted closely together, you close that canopy quicker. Remove it obviously before it becomes a massive infestation, and then planting of thick ground covers. Sometimes that can help too, as far as a cultural method to plant oats or clovers in the spring, and then the fall you could use cereal rye or wheat or vetch to help compete with that, and that just helps slow down germination, to help close that canopy and reduce the sunlight to that species. It does like full sun. So you can see the picture here. That's going to be a difficult location to get in and do traditional mowing or spraying with traditional equipment. You can kind of see here the pictures of the vines spreading out, sending out the vines to try to climb up and over everything. But quickly, let's talk about a little bit about some other management methods besides cultural and pulling it, mechanical, but there's prescribed fire. Unfortunately, prescribed fire is probably not going to be a great tool, and that's been shown through a few studies that it's not, prescribed fire is not a great tool because this plant is an annual, so it's not actively growing typically when you're going to be doing your prescribed fires. The only time you might be able to get some benefit from fire is if you have it in a area where you're trying to introduce species that are more tolerant to fire, and trying to encourage them to make them thicker, like as an example of Indian grass or big blue stem or switchgrass, things, species like that. But you're just trying to have any kind of competition for this for hops. So typically prescribed fire is not going to work well. So what we have used for chemicals, and this by no means is exhaustive at all. We've used triclopyr. Garlon 3A is it also, triclopyr is just the chemical name. Because it has an aquatic labeling, that one is broadleaf specific. So you should not kill the grasses if you are applying it at labeled rates. And then a product like Rodeo, which is just an aquatic glyphosate, you can use that to manage hops. Now keep in mind, glyphosate is going to kill the hops, but also is going to kill what's growing underneath it. So any kind of other beneficial vegetation, you're going to severely impact that. Or in the example of the pictures before where it was growing over trees, if you are treating the hops that's growing over a tree you're trying to save, any product you apply, you need to be aware that you could be damaging those species or the tree underneath the vines. The other chemicals rather that we have used are oust usually in late spring, early summer, and then we've switched to Escort XP, a product that we use at like a 1 ounce per acre, and had pretty good luck with that. Keep in mind neither of those products rather are labeled for aquatic areas, and that's going to be something that you're going to want to carefully read and follow the label as you should with all chemicals and pesticides. Make sure that the product that you are applying is labeled for where you're applying it. If you have to apply onto the hops and you're going to get some of that product into water, you're going to need to make sure you have the right product. So in terrestrial areas, as you've seen in some of these pictures, if you have the right conditions, you can use terrestrial products, but just need to make sure that you have the right species or right products rather. And then also you need to apply before the seed set, just like as in any invasive species or many of the noxious weeds. Once that species has produced seed, it generally starts to become dormant, and so it's not doing as much photosynthetic activity. So you need to apply any kind of herbicides before that plant goes to seed. And then, like any of the plants that we're trying to manage, you need to manage that seed bank. And this one appears to have a seed bank that's roughly around 3 years, occasionally greater than 3 years. So if you do any kind of treatment, whether that's mechanical, cultural, chemical, whatever, you need to go back and look for resprouts and manage that seed bank for that amount of time at least, and keep inspecting that area, looking for resprouts, and then doing spot treatments. So that's kind of more about. It's going to be a fairly short presentation, but that's kind of what Japanese hops is and why we are managing it. But some of the common similar species, a couple of those that we typically get in the same area as common hops, and you can kind of see a hand drawing there of the difference between the two. The one on the left being Japanese hops, and the one on the right being common hops. And common hops has 3 lobes versus 5 to 7. It also common hops will not have the downward facing prickles along the stems, or at the species on the left, the Japanese hops don't have the down curved bracts at the petiole. Kind of the rough idea of the difference between the two. So the pictures on the right, you can see the 3 lobes. They're fairly easy to tell apart if you take a little closer look. But keep in mind too that Japanese hops, when it's young, can look like it can have 3 leaves, and especially as it's first starting to grow. So just be sure that you're treating the correct species and not accidentally treating common hops. And then also that's important. That's the common hops is the one that we grow commercially for beer. So we definitely don't want to get rid of that. And then the achenes that you can kind of see here of common hops are similar to Japanese hops, but a little bit bigger and a little bit tighter. So that's where they get the seeds. It's actually the chemistry in common hops. I believe it's called lupulin that makes it bitter. That is so attractive and prized by beer makers, and the chemistry in Japanese hops is not quite as attractive to beer makers. So obviously it grows very well. Otherwise we wouldn't be here talking about Japanese hops. But yeah, so the common hops is the one that we typically make beer out of. Another lookalike species that grows in a similar area, the riparian areas and woodland area, woodside area, not woodside area, edges of woodlands and areas where it can get plenty of sun is wild cucumber. It does have 5 lobes, similar to Japanese hops, where it's going to have 5 to 7, but wild cucumber is always going to have 5. Similar growth habits, trailing and grows up and over everything, but it does have tendrils, and then does not have the downward facing prickles that Japanese hops does. So, and then also on the picture on the left, lower left, you can kind of see what the fruit from wild cucumber looks like. Much different. You won't see that on Japanese hops. So as Michelle had mentioned, we do quite a bit of public education through the Iowa Weed Commissioners Association and the Hawkeye Cooperative Weed Management Area. We have 34 species. We have brochures available rather for 34 species of invasive plants that are threatening Iowa's prairie, woodland, and wetlands, and those are all available at the website you can see below. So I think we will answer some questions. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about Japanese hops. Definitely a species that if you don't have it in your state or in your area that you're managing, one that you can see from that video that it can rapidly take over and dominate your wetland areas and riparian areas. So a species that you're going to want to do some surveying for and jump on that species right away. Okay, I guess we have plenty of time for questions. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. We do have one question, but we have time. So if anyone wants to still add one, please go ahead and do that. But the question we have right now is, can common hops and Japanese hop hybridize?
I think so. I'm not as much of an expert on that, but I believe they can. It would only make sense that they can. As an example, another vining species, brownleaf bittersweet, can hybridize with American bittersweet, which is brownleaf bittersweet is obviously a very problematic species in a similar range, a little slightly different habitat, but those two species can hybridize and look very similar and be difficult to tell apart. So it only makes sense that Japanese hops and common hop can hybridize. I haven't seen that here in Iowa. It may be different in that bittersweet is a perennial and both hop species are an annual, so that may make a difference. There's probably people here on the call that are probably shaking their head and might maybe have better information on that than I do.
Okay. And then another question, do the roots die in winter?
They do, just like any of the annual species. They're going to produce seed. They're going to grow, produce seed, and then die back, and then reproduce from seed. That seed's going to be spread, as we mentioned, from mowing, from wildlife, from water and erosion and wind, and then take off. So they produce a massive amount of seed, but yeah, just like any of the annuals, the rootstock will die during the winter.
Just a side note, I am going to, I put the website for where you can find these brochures in the chat, so you can link to that from the chat if you'd like. I'm also going to put a link into the Hawkeye CWMA. But we have another question, Chris. Do you have any successful management stories? And if so, what management methods were used?
Oh man, it defines successful. We have gone in and really in a couple of our areas where we planted native vegetation, prairie species, into some of our roadside areas that we plant, and again in the Iowa River corridor, and we had a large infestation of Japanese hops overtaking it. In this area, it was obviously a riparian area. We went in and with a couple different broadleaf chemicals. We used a product called Plateau. We tried it out, and I don't remember the use rate for it, but that particular product was it didn't eliminate a lot of our forbs, that prairie forbs that we had put in. It does eliminate some prairie forbs, but it's a broadleaf product. So we were able to establish native vegetation, native grasses fairly quickly within the matter of about a couple of years, with some fairly intense management and some spot spraying, and we were able to push Japanese hops back. Now we did lose a few of our forbs because we put about 35 different species of forbs in, and unfortunately, plateau doesn't kill all forbs or broadleaves, but it does severely set back some, and we had to choose a high enough rate in order to set back Japanese hops, but not kill some of our species of wildflowers. So it was kind of I don't know if that's a success story or not, but it can be managed. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a riparian area, so we managed everything within the right of way, but we weren't able to cross that fence and go over on the private property and manage over there. So you still have a gigantic seed source that could wash into our area that we're trying to manage, and that's something too that most of us as land managers, as landowners, are trying hard to manage the species and the properties that we are in charge of, but you can't necessarily jump the fence or cross that political line. And that's a challenging part of invasive species management, is trying to encourage other landowners to do their part before that species moves onto your property. So as you've seen from these brochures, we do a lot of public education, talking to landowners and encouraging them, even though you can't really tell them to or force them to, trying to encourage them to manage some of these species, whether it's woodland species, grassland species, wetland, whatever, before they become a major infestation on their property and then move on to the areas that you're trying to manage.
We have a question about the cucumber vine. This question specifically talks about the cucumber burr vine. It says it's very aggressive at their location in Indiana. Is that an annual as well?
To my knowledge, it is. At least it is here in Iowa, and it may have a slightly different growth habit there. We have pretty similar climates, so I would assume so. Yeah, I mean, I guess it gets back to the whole definition of invasive species. You know, if it's a problem in your area, but nobody's calling it an invasive species, then yeah, it still could be an invasive species, depending on what you're trying to manage for. They're going to grow in similar areas as far as habitats grow. Other than burr cucumber, they can grow out in a little bit more sun. I've seen those move into agricultural fields and edges, and usually moving from some of our roadsides. But I think the same methods that are going to manage Japanese hops are going to be good management tools for managing burr cucumber, whether you're managing bittersweets or trying to minimize seed production, trying to eliminate that species before it reaches infestation, try to eliminate seed movement. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or not very well, but yeah, I guess if I didn't, then ask it from a different angle. I'll try to give you some other information.
And then there was a question about what's on Iowa's invasive species state list. Do you have any insights into
Sure.
that
Oh yeah.
process, or whether?
I have.
Okay.
I've been working with the Iowa within Iowa for 20 some years now. So we have a noxious weed list, which is 8 species of noxious weeds, which are legally noxious, that landowners are required by law to manage and eliminate seed production on their property, whether that's public property, private property, whatever. As far as invasive species, we don't have a set list of invasive species here in Iowa that people are required to manage. So by that I mean a legally a noxious weed, people are required to manage it on their property. An invasive species has no legal backing, has no ability for any kind of entity to go onto their property and manage it for them and then charge them for that. So that said, those 8 species of noxious weeds are problematic and invasive, but there's quite a few invasive species that are not on the noxious weed list that are large problems, economically, aesthetically, safety-wise. As an example, poison hemlock or wild parsnip. So you can look at poison ivy and call that an invasive species, and is it a problem? Yes, but is it also a native species? Yes. So um, there isn't a definitive list of invasive species in Iowa. Other than we have a lot of invasive species, and we do have a lot of stuff besides beans and corn here that are causing us, some major problems, not just in our natural areas, but in people's backyards and in our roadsides and, throughout the state.
Okay, thank you. Um, we have a little bit different question now. Talking about livestock, can livestock browse on the hop vines, or do the hairs, those prickles you talked about, impact that?
I'm sure they would browse on it. I don't think that. I guess that's a great question. I don't have a great answer for, but I'll take a crack at it. I think they would browse the leaves anyway. The stems with the downward facing prickles, they might not like that. Might not be preferred browse for them. I would be a little concerned about them eating the achenes that are holding the little seeds. But that said, just because of the name, the hop, so it does make it bitter. That it does have the same type of hop, I guess, that you would use in common hops for beer that makes beer bitter. It's going to have similar chemistry. So I don't know if the cow eating the achenes and the seeds, if they would not like that, or if that would pass through them, and if that might just probably just irritate the seed, make it even germinate at even higher rates. But um, that's a great question. I guess we've done quite a bit of work using goats to graze areas that are severely infested with various other species, whether it's honeysuckle or any of the other species that are going to grow that goats can get to. I assume that they will eat hops. That's a good question. I think it could be used as a management tool, possibly. Other than cattle, if you were going to want to close up the canopy as quickly as you can and reduce sunlight exposure, um, so that the hops doesn't have a leg up on many species. And I'm not sure how that will work in a pasture situation or where you're going to have cattle, because they're going to trample down some species. So probably could theoretically be getting more sunlight down to hops.
And then is there concern about wildlife spreading the seed?
Sure, sure. I mean, as it's there's a reason why many of our invasive species are become so invasive. Obviously the natural predators are not there from the original range of these species. So there are species that do a very good job of dispersal via wildlife, via humans, via mowing, and all of our activities. Um, Hops being one of those. I think they could be getting spread some from wildlife, and birds in particular. They're going to do what birds do and spread that seed. And then, as I mentioned before, the most problematic problems with hops is where it's growing and that the seed floats. So when that water grabs hold of that seed and takes it downstream, a mile, 10 miles, 100 miles, a new infestation starts that was never there before. So,
And we did just get a comment that hops can outcompete Phragmites in its native range.
I guess that's good. I don't know. I don't know. There's been times when I've taken pictures of like Oriental bittersweet and Phragmites, and which one's going to win, or reed canary grass and Phragmites, and just really problematic species. And I guess I don't know which one I want to win. Neither one. I guess I'd rather have native species there, but it'll be interesting to watch.
Battle of the Bosses. Yeah, I like that. All right. Wonderful. Well, we seem to have kind of gotten through all of the questions that are in the chat. Um, I just want to thank Chris for his time today, um, and just thank everybody for making the time to be here. If anybody has any follow-up questions, obviously you're welcome to reach out to Chris. I'm
Sure.
also putting my email into the chat right now. You can also reach out to me. We do have one more webinar this year. It's going to be on porcelain berry on December 5th. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, you can go back to mippen.org/presentations and sign up for that. And we hope to see you there. and hope you've enjoyed this series and that we see you all again soon.